Hello, my name is Tara Sklar. I'm a professor of health law here at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. Today, I'll be talking about waivers under COVID-19. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Tracy Nichols. He's a professor of practice here at the College of Law and teaches into our health law and policy program. To begin, it'd be wonderful to know just more about these types of waivers under COVID-19 and how they became activated. Would you mind sharing with us, Professor Nichols, more about this public health emergency?
Sure. First, before we even start, let's make sure that we always remember that everybody on the front line who are taking care of the patients deserve all of our praise because they are there in the battlefield. What we're going to talk about, though, today is the legal side, the regulatory side, and how it has moved so quickly since the time that a public health emergency was declared. I remember that date because it was on my birthday of this year that the government declared a public health emergency.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. Wow. What a change we have had. And of course, this comes under the Public Health Service Act. The government has the authority to do that. What is so amazing to me, and everybody talks about the extraordinary times we are living in, and that's true, is so often in healthcare, which is probably one of the most regulated industries, as you know, that we have in this country. We have volumes of laws and we have volumes of regulations. Generally, it takes years, sometimes a decade for things to move quickly. What did we see in this case? We saw CMS, our number one largest payer, namely Medicare, move mountains and take extraordinary relief under the law by giving waivers. And what a waiver is it's a way you can operate, and the government is basically saying, we are not going to penalize you if you stay within our waivers, even though what we're telling you can do is different than what the law or regulations require you to do. And so I think that is a very fundamental point here. And one of the amazing things about this is fundamentally in healthcare, it's very important on the payment side that there be correct interactions so that when things are coded, they are correctly billed and payment can be provided to the provider. Just the flip side of that is happening now, right? What we have is, yes, we want to pay our providers, but we want to incent the patients not to see the provider unless they are one of the COVID or have a serious emergent or urgent condition. So this is the unusual thing that has occurred here. There has been an intent to get the routine patient to back off, still get care, and get care that'll be paid for. So what happened? Well, CMS issued waivers in the telemedicine area, telehealth we call it. If you think back, Tara, a decade ago, we were talking about telemedicine, right?
Right.
We were talking about, when will radiology be allowed to be done in a teleradiology sense? And things had developed over time, and there were strict rules about who could bill for telemedicine. And those rules apply to what we call CPT codes. And I know in our slides that we will be sharing with our audience, we have some more definition in our CPT codes. Those have been expanded tremendously so that providers can actually see their patients electronically, if you will, where video and audio are available to them, and still bill for it, even though that would not have met the regulation before the waiver was issued. And so this is a substantial change. We see some of the areas, we have the physician office who has a follow-up visit with a patient. They can do that now with a video and audio combination. In the past, we had rules where that had to be an interactive approved device by CMS. Now pretty much CMS is saying, your phone, if you can see and hear on your phone, that's okay. And that is a substantial change. Other areas that they're allowing physicians to actually bill and see patients for include such a variety of areas as, home health, emergency departments, observation codes where you can observe the patients in a hospital setting where in the past you had to come in. Now you can do an observation without coming in and seeing the patient. Some of the inpatient rehab facilities, nursing facilities, you can just go down this list where if you had asked me 6 months ago when these things would be available, I'd say, oh, a decade from now. And yet when we have a public health emergency, they have acted quickly. You can even do some consulting on it in the ICU with telemedicine now.
Right. I think, the combination of being a public health emergency with an infectious disease really brought telemedicine to the forefront. And we have a list of all the different codes and how they've been expanded to these areas where initially someone would have to live in maybe a rural area or an area with a shortage of healthcare providers. And that's all been changed. And that impacts over 60 million Americans now.
This is amazing because in the past, you'd want to use it. There'd be a circumstance you couldn't use it, or if you did, you just didn't get paid. And now what they're basically telling us is we're going to take these CPT codes, we're going to expand them, we're going to pay you because that's the incentive for you to do it and not to put patients at risk because of the possibility of exposure to this virus. It's dramatic. I don't know how to say it differently. It is a dramatic change.
I think that's right. And I think as everything you're saying, I just wanted to add that you don't want to put the patients at risk, but you also don't want to put healthcare providers necessarily at risk, especially when we've had such limited access to PPE and other ways to protect ourselves.
Yeah, that I'm sure is a discussion you all may deal with in a separate session, but the PPE challenges have been just amazing. Amazing how lacking we are with the way this thing hit so fast. Another interesting thing, too, is, over the years, doctors have had to live with what we call the direct supervision rule when they would be billing, right? And so if the doctor's in the office and he's got the nurse practitioners working for him, then he's in the bubble, if you will, of direct supervision. He could bill for those services. Well, now, because of if you have this real-time communication going on, you can have that going on with your assistants, and you really are not all in the office, right? Because the office is closed. So the idea of having to be there has also been waived. That has huge implications. It allows to expand our healthcare workforce's ability to help folks, including residents. They've loosened the rules for residents too, and residents being able to moonlight. I am just overwhelmed at how CMS, I'll be honest about this, I'm totally overwhelmed at how they have jumped in and made this change for our society. I know some states, you're on the East Coast, and I'm in Arizona at the moment. I know some states on the East Coast have even changed the rules a little bit from that. So you may.
Sure. And in Maryland, under Governor Hogan, he made the decision that audio only could count under this real-time communication, which is quite controversial. But that was because a number of folks don't have access to phones that can produce video and audio simultaneously, and they still need care. And I think that I've seen other calls to allow for that in Georgia and other places with large rural communities where they desperately need to talk to a provider, and the provider wants to be reimbursed for that care. And audio only may be one way to allow for that to happen.
We'll get to it a little bit later, but it's an interesting thing too, right? Because you go into the doctor's office routinely, you sign the privacy statements, the notices, and that isn't happening, right? In these real-time interactions. I know some physicians will say, is it okay with you if, which is the right thing to do, was to always ask the patient. But the reality is these things are happening so fast that those rules about getting all these consents, that they can't happen. And so they've been waived. It's just amazing when you think about it.
Correct. And And there's a whole body of literature here that we can provide more information on regarding just how traditionally how a physician-patient relationship is being established, which used to require inpatient. Well, in some states, that's required inpatient visit, but how that's currently being waived now in our environment.
The other thing too is this idea that the physician can also now order you almost be quarantined. Home health, can be done, remotely. And that's a big deal too, because if you're going to tell the patient you have to stay home, then normally there's no follow-up, right? But now you follow up electronically with the patient. And again, we have the ability to have the interactivity taken care of in that regard, so that physician can bill for those services. So.
Right. I think that I'd like to move on to home health rules. I think that's a really important point impacting a lot of people right now. So it's my understanding that a physician has to order a patient to self-quarantine for them to qualify as being confined to their home and then eligible to receive. Is that correct?
Yeah. Then he's got it in his notes, and then the patient's going to be eligible to receive those home services, or you have it also in hospice, right? Because making that diagnosis to be recertified for hospice or something can now be done electronically. Where in the past you had to do that in person. So this is a huge expansion. This is, you're enhancing the payment side of it by saying what's available. You're enhancing the methods of payment, and you're enhancing the access to care for people because they're not coming in. At the same time, that old concept of hands-on care is not available. So when we think about it, it's a little uncertain, not just is for the patient and the physician also.
I think that's right. It's uncertain now, and it's uncertain post-pandemic with what medicine will look like. I think it'd be really it's important to note that even though there's been this major short telehealth expansion in an extremely short period of time, some things are not included.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Your surgery. Okay. Right. Even remote kind of things like that. No interventional procedures. My mind says anesthesia. Likewise, you can't do that. Anesthesia can't leave you and then do its post-op later by video. Got to be there. So, yeah, there are some things that are not included. On the other hand, FQHCs, which we used to call neighborhood health centers, their scope has been expanded. So that's an important thing.
Right. How so?
Well, used to have the thing where you have the rural health rules and the FQHCs that would tie to the rural health. Now, every one of their providers can be seeing all their patients, if you will, telehealth-wise. So the distinction has disappeared, if you will, for temporarily at least. So, when you start thinking about the whole neighborhood health concept and how there's such a group of folks who get their care that way, you may be starting patterns that won't unwind later in people's minds. This, I think, is going to be a challenge for CMS, is where they take it from here. Nothing you and I can solve, but I think it's a challenge for them.
Right. Absolutely. There are additional areas that are impacted beyond what we've been talking about. One thing that's particularly interesting is regarding the mental health psychiatric care. A number of studies look at telemedicine, and they evaluate its efficacy. And one area where it's shown to have, fairly on par efficacy between inpatient and or in-person and telemedicine visits is in telepsychiatry. So that's an area that's been heavily impacted by these rules too, and waivers.
Yeah, and indeed, and that, I presume later on, decades from now, somebody might tie in a study between that and the whole concept of the social determinants of healthcare that we've talked about under other settings, because so many times that psychiatric problem has other, roots in it, and it isn't just medical, for example. And often the social side, by having the ability to have some telehealth, you're having more, you can have more interactions with the patient than you have if they just come in person. So there may be opportunity to really help. But as I said, that's probably a decade from now that somebody will do that study. You know.
Well, you know, so see where we are. But I think that the continual way to keep in touch much more frequently with things, with mental health, with diabetes, this can make a big difference in improving our overall population health.
Yeah, it can. I believe it can. And I also think on the diabetes side, you know, there's that whole diabetes educator component, especially in the ACO world, you know, where you're trying to keep these costs down flat. That's a different curve we're talking about flattening, right? Is the economic side with ACOs. So, you know, if the ACOs can use what's developed in telehealth to get out and reach more folks on a regular basis, it could you know, have a positive effect over time. And you know, one thing too, back to basics for a minute, is the E&M code, right? Your evaluation and management, you know, write-up that doctors have to do. They can now be looking at the patient telehealth-wise over the phone and video and doing their E&M visits, if you will. So not quite a visit, but making their decisions based on, and so that's another thing. I just see this thing is really growing in the future, and maybe this pandemic is going to be pushing us, you know, to further use of our electronic age, if you will. But then that brings up the whole other side, right, of confidentiality, privacy, security, and all of those things. And that's an interesting thing when you talk about CMS waivers, because HIPAA, which we all have learned about over the last decade or so, deals with privacy and security. But it's enforced through the Office of Civil Rights, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think a caution to folks is that although there are some areas where we won't quite call them waivers, maybe they're interpretive, maybe they are a little more expansive on what the Office of Civil Rights will look at, HIPAA is still there. And one needs to be careful of that. In a practical sense, if somebody's at home, you know, the Office of Civil Rights has said, you know, we'll just plain assume that there may be others around and they're going to hear, you know, something that might be private, you know, PHI or whatever, and that's going to be okay in these circumstances. If you have a patient that has a COVID diagnosis, obviously, under the Ryan White Act, you've got to give notice to your responders, right? But under HIPAA and the like, now we're going to let you also, you got to tell the family, and not just tell the public health officials, but you got to tell the family, you got to tell the friends who are going to care for the person. In other words, there is this expansion recognizing the dynamic of the disease. So even though HIPAA per se is still there, I think that the interpretation is more expansive because of the need to try to solve the problem of the therapeutic side and not just the diagnosis side. So
that's right. And you can have providers who have the best of intentions to be compliant with HIPAA, but the reality is many of them might be brand new to delivering the medicine via telehealth. So they don't have all the systems in place where they can make sure that the information is encrypted and protected in a platform they haven't yet created to get reimbursed. Like, where do you start? So I think that the good faith use is an important provision to keep in mind for why we're currently in this place, is because the ramp up was so rapid.
Right. OCR has Office of Civil Rights has said that as long as there's good faith in what you're doing, they're going to step back. They're not going to enforce some of the penalties for violations of HIPAA. I mean, you can imagine that, you know, this is obviously not healthcare as usual, right? And once somebody has that diagnosis, I mean, the fear factor and the possibility of other exposures, you know, is just really high. And so there has to be an understanding and a method by which that information can get out. You know, if somebody's going to move a patient from one location to the other, the transportation folks have to know about it. They have to be able to be careful. If you're going to have family involved, if you're quarantine somebody at home, they got to know it, right? Obviously, the hospitals have areas set aside, but so there is a whole host of things that have to happen. And I think, again, I think it's a very positive that the government said, we're going to have a good faith look at all this. We're not going to be real dogmatic. We're not saying it goes away, but we're going to take a look, and we're going to let you use your professional judgment on how you're going to get the information out.
Right. And, all this in mind, we are dealing literally in an emergency situation. So that's where we are right now. But I think it's important to have what you've referred to as words of caution. If you could walk us through what to expect and maybe some of this aftermath and how providers can continue to protect themselves and patients depending where things might fall out.
Right. As a society, we always have this tendency to always look back, the Monday morning quarterback, if you will, we used to call that, right? So you look at what did happen, what could have happened, did this person do this right, did they not? There's always sort of this tendency of accountability and looking back. So we don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. The mere fact that they may open up, business-wise doesn't mean the virus stops, right? So we may have this pandemic time for healthcare workers and their struggles going on for some time. It's important to remember that you want to document why you've made the decisions you've made, And so if you're dealing with a patient, you're still going to document the patient's electronic health record with, because of the COVID circumstances, the patient was seen on a telemedicine visit, blah, blah, blah. Just a few words in there so that, somebody stranger to this looking at it a few years from now, okay, that's why this was done. And I think that's important. I think documenting those kind of decisions is important. Memories fade. They just tend to do that. And, there's an old saying, like in a lot of the healthcare specialties, nursing says, if it's not documented, it wasn't done. That's one of their buzzwords. It may have been done, but that's what they use. And I think that's sort of the watchword here. The words of wisdom are document it. Don't over document it. You don't have to over document, but you got enough to say a few things. And then we watch it, and we see if more guidance is going to come out, and you can pay attention, and you can go to the different sites. We have some, I think in our presentation, you've got others on this website for the law school, and the providers can take a moment to sort of catch up in these areas.
Sure. Is there anything you think to be aware of with how suddenly these waivers might be revoked? What do you think it might be like? How would you describe what might happen in the near future?
I expect that there will be announcements that will come out that are going to give you some leeway. Like we expect that a certain amount, you may get a 30-day notice or something like that. I don't think they're going to come overnight because the sites are different, right? What's happening on the battlefield in New York may not be, or California may not be what's happening in Texas or Wyoming or something. The battlefields are going to be a little different. So I think that the CMS will be cautious about how they do it, but one can always should look at the CMS website, I would think, on a weekly basis and see if there's any new COVID announcements coming out, especially on the Medicare side.
Great. Thank you. Well, this has been very informative, and I know that you're also going to be doing more on this topic in your course that's coming up this fall, which is called Legal and Regulatory Aspects for Healthcare Delivery. Is anything more you'd like to tell us about the course that you plan to teach this fall?
Well, this fall we'll be doing 2 courses, right? We're going to do one for, I guess we'll call them the graduate students, the law students, the nursing students, the professional faculties and the like. That's our 578 course. And then we're going to do one for undergrads who are juniors and seniors and have an interest in healthcare in one form or another. And we'll be those folks are looking, I think, at their bachelor's of legal studies or whatever is the famous buzzword at the moment for that stuff. But so we'll be doing both, and we cover in that course a wide spectrum of the laws, the regulations, the interaction of the economics of healthcare with the development of the laws, and we try to provide some practical, examples throughout the entire course. Begins, I think, end of August.
That's right, and
get it on the website, right? Get it on the website.
Right, right. Well, this has been very, very helpful. I think we've laid out a lot of key terms and things that are happening right now in the field, as well as really acknowledged what healthcare providers are going through and where federal and state governments are trying to meet them. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Nichols.
You're welcome. Stay well. Stay healthy.